They thought grief had made me fragile when the estate attorney announced my husband would inherit everything, $580 million, and my father's empire. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just waited for the sealed will to be opened, because silence was the only move they never saw coming. The chapel smelled of lilies and polished wood, the kind of scent that tries too hard to make grief look elegant. My father had built a global logistics empire from a rented warehouse and a stubborn belief that timing was everything. Now his portrait stood beside the casket, steady gaze, silver hair, that faint half-smile that always meant he knew more than he was saying. I sat in the front row, black dress, spine straight, hands folded in my lap. Across the aisle, my husband Daniel held court with quiet confidence. He accepted condolences as if they were congratulations. His hand rested on my shoulder once, too firmly, too performative. The pressure lingered long after he let go. When the estate attorney cleared his throat near the altar, conversations softened into expectation. The board members had come, senior executives, investors. They weren't just mourning a man. They were waiting for numbers, and numbers arrived quickly. In accordance with the primary will filed 12 years ago, the attorney began, voice measured and dry. The majority ownership of Harland Global Holdings, including controlling shares currently valued at approximately $580 million, transfers to Daniel Mercer. A ripple moved through the room, sharp, electric, almost indecent against the velvet hush of a funeral. I didn't look at Daniel. I didn't need to. I could feel his satisfaction bloom like heat beside me. Someone behind us whispered, "Of course." Another voice added, "He's been practically running it already." Practically. The word slid under my skin. Daniel leaned closer, breath warm against my ear. "I'll make sure you're taken care of," he murmured softly, as if offering generosity instead of control. Sympathy flickered in a few glances sent my way. Poor daughter, emotional, probably uninterested in corporate warfare. If only they knew, the attorney continued, reading clauses about asset transitions, voting rights, interim authority. It sounded final, clean, efficient, too clean. Because my father was many things, brilliant, stubborn, occasionally impossible, but he was never careless. He trusted very few people, and blind trust was not one of his habits, especially not in business, especially not with power. And Daniel had entered the company only 5 years ago. My mind replayed a conversation from 3 months earlier. We had been in my father's study, late evening, city lights bleeding into the dark windows. He had poured 2 glasses of scotch and watched the ice melt before speaking. "Control," he said quietly, "is never given in one document." I hadn't understood then. Now I did. The estate attorney closed the folder containing the primary will. Applause did not follow. This wasn't a gala, but relief did. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from waiting. Daniel stood to shake hands with 2 board members before the casket had even been lowered into the ground. That was when the attorney spoke again. "There is, however, an additional instrument." The air shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, just a subtle tightening, like the moment before a storm when birds disappear from the sky. Daniel froze mid-gesture. The attorney reached into a slim black case and withdrew a smaller envelope. Thick paper. Red wax seal. My father's crest pressed into it. "Per instruction," he continued, "this sealed will is to be opened only after the primary will has been publicly acknowledged." A murmur rippled through the executives. Confusion replaced certainty. Daniel's fingers curled slightly at his side. "I wasn't informed of any additional filings," he said evenly, though the muscle in his jaw twitched. The attorney didn't respond to him. He looked at me, not with sympathy, with recognition. Something cold and steady settled in my chest. Grief still lived there, raw and heavy, but beneath it, something else had begun to rise. Not anger, not vengeance, strategy. The wax seal cracked softly in the quiet chapel, and for the first time since the announcement of $580 million slipping from my last name to my husband's, I allowed myself the smallest breath of calm, because my father never played a single move. He played the board, and if you think Daniel understood what was about to happen, you haven't been paying attention. The sound of the wax breaking was almost delicate, soft, precise, irreversible. Every executive in the front rows leaned forward as if drawn by an invisible string. Even the lilies seemed to hold their breath. The estate attorney unfolded the thick parchment slowly, carefully, as though speed itself would be disrespectful. Daniel straightened beside me. I could feel calculation replacing confidence. His posture shifted from triumph to assessment. He was already running scenarios in his head. He always did. The attorney began reading. This supplemental will supersedes any operational authority implied in the primary document under specific conditions outlined herein. A flicker, subtle, but there. Daniel's expression didn't crack, but it tightened. The room sensed it. The attorney continued, voice steady. In the event of my death, while ownership of controlling shares transfers as stated, full execution authority over Harland Global Holdings, including voting coordination, strategic asset control, and board override rights, shall be entrusted to the appointed executor. A pause, not theatrical, just long enough. My pulse didn't quicken, it slowed. Executor, the attorney said clearly, is my daughter, Alexandra Harland. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was impact. Someone behind us inhaled sharply. A board member shifted in his seat. Another executive whispered, "What does that mean exactly?" It meant everything. Daniel turned to me slowly. No anger yet. Just disbelief carefully disguised as composure. "This must be a technical designation," he said under his breath. "Administrative." I met his eyes for the first time that morning. "Maybe," I replied softly. The attorney adjusted his glasses. As executor, Ms. Harland retains authority to approve, suspend, or restructure any executive decision made by the majority shareholder until final estate settlement is completed. The words settled like iron. The company may have transferred to Daniel on paper, but control had not. A wave of emotion hit me, grief blending with something sharper. My father had known enough to divide ownership from authority, known enough to create distance between power and impulse. Daniel forced a thin smile. "Well," he said louder now, addressing the nearby executives, "this simply ensures stability during transition." Stability. But the board members weren't nodding the way they had earlier. Because executor authority wasn't symbolic. It meant I could review financial decisions, approve executive contracts, audit recent acquisitions, freeze restructuring proposals. And Daniel had been very busy in the past 6 months. A memory surfaced, late-night phone calls he'd taken outside, abrupt schedule changes, a rushed acquisition proposal my father had questioned only weeks before his passing. The tension in Daniel's shoulders betrayed something new. Not victory, risk. The estate attorney closed the supplemental document. All actions taken by majority shareholder will require executor acknowledgement effective immediately. Immediately. The word hung heavier than the value of $580 million. A board member cleared his throat. So, until estate settlement is finalized, she oversees executive authority. Yes, the attorney replied. Eyes turned toward me again, but differently now, not with pity, not with dismissal, with recalibration. Daniel leaned closer, his voice no longer warm. You don't have the experience to manage this level of oversight. There it was, the first crack. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. Good thing I have full access to every file. His jaw tightened. Grief returned in a sudden wave, almost knocking the breath from me. I wanted my father back, not his strategy, not his wealth, him, his voice in that quiet study, his steady belief that timing was everything. But he had given me something else, position. And Daniel had just realized that the inheritance announcement had not been the end of the story. It had been the beginning. The funeral concluded with muted handshakes and careful smiles. Conversations shifted from condolences to compliance. Legal terminology replaced sympathy. The board scheduled an emergency review meeting for Monday morning. Daniel walked beside me toward the exit, each step measured. You're overestimating this, he said quietly. Am I? Because executor authority opens doors most shareholders forget exist. And if you think Daniel's concern is only about paperwork, wait until the first audit request hits his desk. If this shift in power surprised you, follow the story to see how quiet authority changes everything. Have you ever seen someone underestimate the wrong person? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe to watch how strategy speaks louder than ownership. Monday arrived dressed in glass and steel. Harland Global's headquarters rose above the city like a monument to precision, every window reflecting order, every line sharp and intentional. I had grown up wandering its corridors after school, the scent of printer ink and fresh contracts more familiar to me than playground dust. Today, the lobby felt different, not hostile, not welcoming, evaluating. As the elevator climbed toward the executive floor, my reflection stared back at me from mirrored walls. Black tailored suit, no jewelry except my father's watch. Grief had settled into something quieter now, like a stone carried in the pocket instead of pressed against the throat. When the doors opened, conversations dipped, not silenced, adjusted. Daniel was already inside the boardroom, leaning against the long walnut table, speaking in low tones to two senior directors. His posture radiated control, practiced, curated. He looked up as I entered. For half a second, his expression faltered. Then the smile returned. Alexandra, he said smoothly. Ready to observe? Observe. I took my seat at the head of the table. Ready to execute, I corrected gently. A ripple passed through the room, small but unmistakable. The estate attorney sat near the far end, files stacked neatly before him. Beside him, corporate counsel had a tablet open, stylus poised. The words sealed will seemed to echo in everyone's memory, though no one said them aloud. Daniel began the meeting with confident momentum. As majority shareholder, I propose accelerating the Westbridge acquisition and restructuring the European division to free capital. The screen behind him lit up with projections, numbers, growth curves, efficiency promises. On the surface, it looked impressive, too impressive. I waited until he finished speaking before sliding a thin folder across the table. Before we proceed, I said calmly, I'm exercising executor authority to request a temporary review of all acquisition-related communications from the past 6 months. Silence. Daniel blinked once. That's unnecessary. The board has already reviewed. The board reviewed summaries. I interrupted gently. I'm requesting original correspondence, vendor negotiations, side letters, advisory fee agreements. The corporate counsel looked up, The CFO shifted in his seat. Daniel's smile thinned. "You're implying impropriety?" "I'm ensuring clarity," I replied. The difference was subtle, but devastating. Sympathy began to shift toward curiosity. Curiosity toward concern, because no one challenges a clean deal unless there's a reason. Daniel moved to the screen, tapping through slides faster than before. "We're on a timeline," he said. "Delays cost money." "So do overlooked liabilities," I answered. The tension in the room tightened like a drawn wire. I wasn't raising my voice. I wasn't accusing. I was invoking policy, and policy is colder than anger. The estate attorney cleared his throat. "Under executor authority, Ms. Harland is within her rights to initiate document review prior to approval." There it was again, within her rights. Daniel's jaw flexed. "Fine," he said evenly. "Review it." But I noticed the faint sheen on his forehead, the way his hand lingered too long on the edge of the table, the way one of the directors avoided his gaze. Because this wasn't just about an acquisition. 3 weeks before my father's death, he had rejected this same proposal, called it premature, requested further due diligence. Daniel had revived it within days of the funeral. Timing. My father's voice echoed in my mind. Control is never given in one document. The meeting adjourned without vote, no celebration, no decisive momentum, just postponement. As executives filtered out, murmurs replaced certainty. "Did you know about this review?" one director whispered to another. "Not in detail," came the uneasy reply. Daniel lingered behind as the room emptied. When the door closed, his composure slipped, not shattered, but strained. "You're making this adversarial," he said quietly. "No," I answered. "I'm making it transparent." His eyes searched my face as if trying to find hesitation. Weakness, doubt. He didn't find it, because grief had burned those things away. "I built relationships here," he continued. "They trust me." "They trusted my father too," I replied softly. "That's why he separated ownership from authority." For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Fear, not of losing money, of losing narrative. As I stepped into the corridor, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long geometric shadows across the marble floor. The building felt less like a monument now, and more like a chessboard, and the first piece had just been moved. By Wednesday, the building no longer felt like a monument. It felt like a listening device. Emails were shorter, meetings were recorded for clarity. Assistants who once filtered information effortlessly now copied legal on routine correspondence. The air conditioning hummed a little louder, as if trying to cool down rising speculation. My request for acquisition communications had triggered something far more powerful than confrontation. It had triggered scrutiny. Stacks of digital files began flowing into a secure review portal. Advisory contracts, consultant invoices, side agreements drafted in unusually vague language. I spent hours inside the executive archive room, its glass walls frosting automatically for privacy. The silence inside felt almost surgical. The first inconsistency appeared quietly. An advisory fee structured as a strategic acceleration bonus, payable to a third-party firm, approved 2 days after my father had postponed the acquisition. The firm's name sounded generic, polished, harmless, until I traced its registration. Recently formed, limited history, shared legal representation with a private investment group Daniel had consulted for before joining our company. My pulse didn't spike. It sharpened. I flagged the document for legal cross-reference and kept reading. Because impulsive discovery is dramatic, methodical discovery is unstoppable. Later that afternoon, the CFO requested a private meeting. His office overlooked the river, gray water sliding steadily between steel bridges. He closed the door with deliberate care. "Off the record," he began, fingers steepled. "The accelerated advisory payments concerned your father." Concerned. "Why weren't they halted?" I asked evenly. "They were within shareholder authority," he replied. At the time, I nodded slowly. "And now?" he exhaled. "Now the executor has broader discretion." There it was again, the shift. Daniel entered the boardroom during the next executive session with visible restraint. His tone was controlled, almost overly calm. "I assume we're nearing the end of this review?" he asked lightly. "Not yet," I replied. "We've identified external compensation structures that require clarification." His gaze locked onto mine. "Clarification of what?" "Alignment," I said. The word settled heavily. One of the directors leaned forward. "Are we exposed?" "Not yet, but exposure is rarely loud at first. It begins as a hairline crack." The estate attorney summarized the findings without embellishment. "Preliminary analysis suggests potential conflicts of interest tied to advisory disbursements. Further review is recommended before acquisition approval." Daniel's knuckles whitened subtly against the table's edge. "You're questioning my integrity?" he asked, measured but strained. "I'm questioning documentation," I answered, because documentation does not argue back. Sympathy in the room shifted again, away from performance toward protection. Protection of shareholders, of legacy, of reputation. And reputation is worth more than $580 million. That evening, I returned to my father's study for the first time since the funeral. Dust particles drifted in golden light from the tall windows. His desk remained exactly as he'd left it, precise stacks, fountain pen aligned parallel to the blotter. Inside the bottom drawer, I found a leather notebook, not dramatic, not hidden, just waiting. The final entries weren't emotional. They were analytical, notes about leadership transitions, observations about ambition outrunning prudence. A single line circled twice. Trust structure, not charm. I closed the notebook gently. Grief returned, not as weakness, but as fuel. He had seen something forming, something he hadn't fully stopped, but he had positioned me to finish it. The next morning, legal completed its deeper audit of the advisory firm. The ownership trail led, indirectly but undeniably, to a holding entity where Daniel retained silent equity. Not illegal on its face, but undisclosed. Undisclosed conflicts don't destroy companies immediately. They erode them. An emergency board session was scheduled. Daniel arrived composed but quieter. The effortless certainty was gone, replaced by calculation edged with caution. When legal presented the findings, no one spoke for several seconds. Finally, one director asked the only question that mattered. "Why wasn't this disclosed?" Daniel's answer came smoothly. "It wasn't material." Material. The CFO leaned back slowly. $5 million in advisory acceleration tied to an entity connected to our majority shareholder is material. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The board voted to suspend the acquisition pending independent investigation. Additionally, a motion passed to temporarily restrict unilateral financial approvals by the majority shareholder until estate settlement concluded. Ownership remained Daniel's. Authority tightened around him like a closing fist. When the meeting ended, he stood very still. "This isn't over," he said quietly as we exited into the corridor. "No," I agreed. "It's just transparent now. And transparency has a way of reshaping power faster than confrontation ever could." The announcement did not come with sirens or headlines. It arrived in the form of a carefully worded internal memorandum sent at 8:03 a.m. on a Thursday. Subject line, Governance Update. By then, the independent investigation had concluded what the board already sensed. The advisory entity tied to Daniel had not violated criminal statutes, but it had breached fiduciary disclosure standards outlined in the company's executive ethics framework. Not illegal, unacceptable. The distinction mattered. The board convened one final time in the same walnut-paneled room where confidence had once radiated so easily from him. Morning light filtered through the glass walls, softer now, less theatrical. Even the city beyond the windows seemed muted, as if waiting. Daniel sat straighter than usual, suit impeccable, expression controlled. But control without leverage is performance. The lead independent director spoke first. Given the findings, and in the interest of preserving shareholder trust, we are voting to restructure executive authority effective immediately. No raised voices, no dramatics, just policy doing what policy was designed to do. The motion passed with decisive clarity. Daniel would retain majority ownership of shares, as stipulated in the primary will, but operational control, strategic approvals, acquisition authority, executive appointments would transfer to a newly formed governance committee chaired by the executor, chaired by me, temporary, on paper, transformational, in practice. Daniel's silence this time wasn't strategic. It was stunned. After the vote, the room emptied with the quiet efficiency of professionals who understood that legacy was being protected, not destroyed, preserved. He approached me near the window overlooking the river. "You orchestrated this," he said, voice low. I met his gaze evenly. "No, I enforced structure." "There is a difference." He searched my face for triumph, for cruelty, for revenge. He found none, because this was never about humiliation. It was about alignment. "My father built this company on disclosure and discipline," I continued calmly. "You mistook access for entitlement." The words didn't slice. They settled. For a moment, I saw something unexpected in his expression. Not anger, not even resentment. Regret. But regret doesn't undo documentation. Weeks later, the estate settlement concluded. The sealed will's final provisions activated fully. My executor authority transitioned seamlessly into permanent executive leadership, as permitted under the governance amendments my father had embedded years earlier. A contingency within a contingency. Control was never given in one document. The public announcement framed it as strategic continuity under Alexandra Harlan's leadership. Markets responded steadily. Investors valued stability more than spectacle. Daniel stepped down from operational involvement to pursue independent ventures. The phrasing was generous. The reality was precise. Reputation, once unquestioned, now carried an asterisk. And I? I stood in my father's former office on the first morning it officially became mine. The city stretched beyond the glass, alive, indifferent, full of motion. His watch rested against my wrist, ticking steadily. Grief still lived there, but so did clarity. I didn't win by shouting in a chapel. I didn't win by accusing in anger. I won because structure outlasts ego, because silence can be strategic, because documentation, when patient, becomes undeniable. The empire remained intact, the legacy remained clean, and the next time someone mistakes quiet for weakness, they'll remember this boardroom. Ownership may begin a story, but control, real control, is written in the fine print.